Hi everyone, my name is Austin, and I'm a huge James Bond fan. You may not have realized it, but I have a huge appreciation for the James Bond franchise, going all the way back when I caught pieces of The World Is Not Enough and You Only Live Twice off of television, as well as eventually catching GoldenEye in its entirety off of Cinemax. Same goes for Tomorrow Never Dies. I soon remember getting the DVD for GoldenEye one Christmas, along with a copy of Jimmy Neutron Boy Genius and the 2010 GoldenEye video game for the Wii, and later got other DVDs for some James Bond movies, usually in the Dollar General bargain bin, including Thunderball, more on that later, Live and Let Die, and Tomorrow Never Dies, and in other areas such as thrift stores I often shopped at, Casino Royale, Die Another Day, and Quantum of Solace. In fact, just this past year, me and Ace made it our goal to get all of the James Bond movies on DVD, not counting the Blu-ray DVD combo pack of No Time to Die that had been acquired 3 years ago, which included all 4 of the James Bond Ultimate Edition box sets, which also supplants the previous DVDs that had been acquired due to a lack of extras on the ones prior to the Ultimate Editions, finding the Blu-ray DVD combo pack for Skyfall and the standard DVD for Spectre, albeit as a rental exclusive, which is just the movie itself on DVD, just without the video blogs found on the regular retail version, as we felt the desire to watch all of the James Bond movies released up to that point, especially in case the next one comes out in the future. You can never be too careful. But beyond that, they're the kinds of movies that, before there was Star Wars or the multitude of different Marvel movies that would come out in the following years, were what would become the quintessential action-adventure films that audiences would come to see. And with their stylish action scenes, gorgeous cinematography, gun barrel openings, catchy theme songs, and of course, the bottomless supply of beautiful women seemingly popping up on every corner, ranging from good to bad, from blonde to brunette, from long-lasting to ill-fated, and breaking the boundaries of race in certain cases. The James Bond movies were the things that audiences in the 1960s lived for, and even now are the most iconic parts of pop culture history. And considering it's one of the longest running film franchises of all time, it's fair to say that these films have transcended from just a series of books from one Ian Fleming and into a beast all its own. And to think it all started with an adaptation of the 6th book that would become the start of one of the most iconic film franchises known to man, and that was back in 1962. From Dr. No and up until License to Kill, they were all produced by one Albert R. Broccoli, who worked on every film up until his death on June 27, 1996, and that's not counting Harry Saltzman's involvement, which stayed until 1974's The Man with the Golden Gun, and after that, Broccoli's daughter Barbara and his stepson Michael G. Wilson would produce every Bond film until 2021. And almost all of them were produced through a company founded by Broccoli and Saltzman in 1961 called Eon Productions, which handles any and all James Bond affairs. James Bond is one of those where whenever I put one on, I have a good time from beginning to end. Whether it be Daniel Craig's more serious tenure, the dark nature of On Her Majesty's Secret Service and License to Kill, to the downright silliness that is Moonraker, each film is entertaining from beginning to end, and each film has its own style of humor that, even as goofy as some films can get, always shines through and makes for some fun times in between all the action, both in and out of the bedroom. But I won't be focusing on those films specifically, as much as I would love to do so. Rather, I'm going to be focusing on the unofficial James Bond films. Yeah, these were some films that were produced without the association of either Eon Productions Robert R. Broccoli, Harry Saltzman, Barbara Broccoli, Michael G. Wilson, or anyone that's ever been involved with the James Bond franchise. These were films that were unofficially produced through a certain other company or certain other producers. Like, there's a bunch out there. Well, actually, there's two out there. Those being an adaptation of Casino Royale from 1967 starring David Niven as James Bond and a cast that also includes Peter Sellers and Woody Allen. That didn't do very well, and I only know of it because it's been featured on the Cinema Snob and he didn't have nice things to say about it. And then there's also this film. And as you can see, it's included in a 3-pack here with some other films. And that is this film right here. Never Say Never Again. Directed by Irvin Kershner, starring Sean Connery once again as James Bond in his last on-screen performance, as well as featuring the likes of Kim Basinger and even Rowan Atkinson in the film. So without further ado, let's talk about it. The plot for Never Say Never Again can be pretty much summed up like this. It's Thunderball. That's pretty much the plot of this movie. It is basically another adaptation of Thunderball following the 1965 film that Connery had starred in over 18 years ago at the time of Never Say Never Again's release. The story follows James Bond as he's reluctantly brought back into action to track down and prevent the launch of 2 nuclear missiles which were stolen by Spectre, or the Special Executive for Counterintelligence, Terrorism, Revenge, and Extortion. That's basically it. There are some changes to accommodate to the fact that Connery was 52 at the time of filming, which is mentioned in film, and certain characters had changes, like instead of Emilio Largo, you have Maximilian Largo, who has no eye patch, unlike the previous version. Domino here is known as Domino Patacci instead of either Dominetta Domino Vitali or Dominique Domino Derval, and instead of Fiona Volpe, you have a similar character known as Fatima Blush. And many other changes I can't name here, but otherwise, you're essentially watching Thunderball, 1983 edition. Now, is this inherently a bad thing? No, it's really not. Thunderball is a great movie, and was actually the first Connery Bond film I had seen back then. And really, it is cool to see this story being told again, just with an older, more experienced James Bond. Something that, as of now, hasn't been completely explored yet. So, there's something unique. But yeah, there's not much else to say here, so let's go to the production. The production for Never Say Never Again is a story that is something that can only be described as a mouthful, as its origins can be traced back to the early 60s, because Thunderball, Ian Fleming's 8th book in the Bond series, was originally intended to be a screen adaptation of James Bond, with Fleming working with independent producer Kevin McClory, who would cause a whirlwind of headaches for the franchise that would last decades, and screenwriter Jack Whittingham on a script for a potential Bond film, which was to be called Longitude 38 West. This didn't happen due to the costs that would have been involved. Fleming, not wanting this idea to go to waste, turned it into the novel Thunderball, not crediting either McClory or Whittingham, with the former being ticked off over the Bond creator's failure to name him in the creation of the novel, so he sought to take Fleming to the High Court in London for breach of copyright, being settled in 1963. Once Eon Productions began making their Bond movies, they made sure to make a deal with McClory so that Thunderball could be made, where he was credited as a producer, for which after 10 years, there could be no further adaptations of the novel produced. By the mid-1970s, McClory was getting fast to work on another version of Thunderball, being done under the title Warhead, and bringing on Len Deighton, a spy novel writer best known for The Ipcress File, which would be adapted into a film produced by Bond producer Harry Saltzman and starring Michael Caine, to work on the script with Sean Connery's involvement. Oh, and in a lawsuit with Eon, McClory also gained the sole rights to the character of Ernst Stavro Blofeld and Spectre, which forced Eon to have them removed from The Spy Who Loved Me. I just thought you should know that.
What an asshole! Son of a bitch! Son of a bitch!
I don't like him.
The script for Warhead initially focused on Spectre shooting aircraft down over the Bermuda Triangle before capturing Liberty Island and Ellis Island as staging areas for an invasion of New York City via the sewers of Wall Street, which feels like a killer rat movie crossed with Red Dawn and feeling very America-driven with its setting, not unlike a more official Bond film, A View to a Kill, which would come out 2 years later. Anyway, this initial idea was purchased by Paramount Pictures in 1978. This ran into some hurdles, however, as Danjaq and United Artists had accused the production of going beyond copyright restrictions, which locked McClory into only being able to adapt Thunderball, which further delayed the project. Near the end of the 1970s, developments on the project were reported under the name James Bond and the Secret Service, but Jack Schwartzman, father of Jason Schwartzman, second husband of Talia Shire, and brother-in-law to Francis Ford Coppola, and producer of Rad, became involved in 1980 and managed to clear a lot of legal issues that clouded the project, but chose not to use Dayton's script, instead opting to go the route of "We got a nuclear bomb" plot of the original Thunderball, so as to divert another lawsuit from Danjaq, and after McClory saw Jimmy Carter bring up the issue during his debate in 1980 when running against Ronald Reagan. Schwartzman soon brought on Lorenzo Semple Jr. to put together a screenplay, for which he wanted it to be a middle ground between his work on the 1960s Batman show and his more serious works like Papillon, The Parallax View, and The 3 Days of the Condor. Connery wasn't on board with certain story beats, and did try to get Tom Mankiewicz to help out, as he had done so for Diamonds Are Forever, and would also write the script for Live and Let Die, The Man with the Golden Gun. But he said no, feeling more faithful toward Albert R. Broccoli than anybody else. Semple Jr. soon left the production, this coming just after Irvin Kershner, the man behind The Empire Strikes Back and later RoboCop 2, was hired as director, and Schwartzman began cutting out some big numbers to try to cut back on the movie's budget, and Connery brought on British TV writers Dick Clement and Ian LaFreniere, who would do the writing for The Commitments, and even flushed away, to do rewrites, but had to go uncredited because of the Writers Guild of America, even though almost everything they created was their own work, for which they continued to write during the making of the film, often changing it day by day. Another thing that underwent a change was the title, which was the last change made and is a reference to the fact that after Connery made Diamonds Are Forever, he vowed to never portray James Bond ever again. Something which Connery's wife, Micheline, suggested a title in reference to it, calling it Never Say Never Again. And you could tell the producers liked it because they credited her with coming up with the title during the end credits. There was one final attempt by Fleming's trustees to stop the film from being made by having the High Court block it in spring of 1983, but this was soon thrown out and the production was allowed to proceed without any other monkey business. unless they wanted Dr. No in the film, because there could have been some monkey business. Anyway, let's get to the cast and crew for this thing. The casting was quite interesting, as when old Kev McClory had first thought up the idea back in 1964, he initially was in talks to have Richard Burton play James Bond, which didn't happen because of all the legal issues that were rampant. Back when Warhead was in production during the late 1970s, there were plenty of actors mentioned in the trade press as being in consideration, including Orson Welles as Blofeld, which would have been his second time playing a Bond villain following his portrayal of Le Chiffre in Casino Royale 1967, Trevor Howard as M, he had previously been considered to play Bond during Dr. No's production, and to direct it all, Richard Attenborough was an option. So, there's a concept. In 1978, during the time when the project was known as James Bond and the Secret Service, Sean Connery was in talks to play the character once again, and it almost ended up going to go head-to-head with Moonraker. But by 1980, legal hurdles caused the project to once again stall, and Connery even thought he was more likely to play Pee Wee Herman than Bond, claiming in an interview with Sunday Press, "When I first worked on the script with Len, I had no thought of actually being in the film." Once Jack Schwartzman got involved though, as we have mentioned, all the problems were mostly solved, which included persuading Connery to play Bond, where he negotiated a fee of $3 million, which in 2024 was estimated to be $9 million, casting and script approval, and a percentage of the profits. And subsequent to his casting, Lorenzo Semple Jr. altered the script to reflect the fact that at 52 years old, Connery wasn't exactly a spring chicken, which included many references to Bond's age, which academic Jeremy Black has noted other aspects of age and disillusionment, such as with the Shrublands Porter referring to Bond's car,
My word, they don't make them like this anymore.
the new M having no need for the double O's, and Q having less gadgets. There was even an attempt by Semple Jr. to hammer the point home that Bond was getting old by having him in pseudo-retirement working aboard a Scottish fishing trawler on the hunt for Soviet Navy submarines in the North Sea. But this was a no-go. Meanwhile, Connery was alleged to have been announced as being Bond in March 1983, and no joke, trained with Steven Seagal to get into shape for the production. Nowadays, if Steven Seagal got a lobotomy to replace his ego for a comeback vehicle, he'd have to train with Jackie Chan in order to get into shape. For the Emilio Largo stand-in, his presumed half-brother, Maximilian, Connery suggested Klaus Maria Brandauer, who in 1981 starred in a Hungarian film called Mephisto, which won an Oscar for Best Foreign Language Film. And through the same route, they were also able to find Max von Sydow and get him to play Ernst Stavro Blofeld, who, funny enough, was able to retain his Eon-originated white cat in the film, as opposed to the replacing it with a dog, or using a black cat, or having a pet bunny. As for Fatima Blush, Fiona Volpe's second cousin twice removed, director Irvin Kershner chose former model and Playboy cover girl Barbara Carrera to play the character, with the name Fatima Blush originating from one of the early scripts of Thunderball, which the actress took note of the Hindu goddess Kali, and in what she basically described as a little bit of a Black Widow and a little bit of a praying mantis placed into a blender.
Bitch.
For this, Carrera actually got a Golden Globe nomination for Best Supporting Actress, losing to Cher for her role in Silkwood. For Domino, Micheline Connery, Sir Connery's wife, met with Kim Basinger, who was just beginning to get steam in Hollywood, at Grosvenor House Hotel in London and recommended her to good old Sean, which he was on board with following a refusal from Delilah de Lazaro, who would play the head mistress in Phenomenon. How about that? Connery spoke with Bernie Casey about playing Felix Leiter, where he said that no one remembered the character, so having an African American play the role would make it more memorable, predating Jeffrey Wright's portrayal by 23 years, and other cast members included Rowan Atkinson, who would parody Bond with Johnny English in 2003, who was added by Dick Clement and Ian LaFreniere after the production was well underway in order to get some comic relief, while Edward Fox was cast as M to make the character a young technocrat versus Bernard Lee's older portrayal, and to function as a satire for the Thatcher administration's budget cuts to government services. As for the crew, Connery attempted to get Richard Donner to direct the film, but he disliked the script following a meeting between the two. Peter R. Hunt, a former editor for Eon, who was responsible for Connery's first 5 Bond films as an editor and director of On Her Majesty's Secret Service, was approached but declined due to his previous work for the company. So Irvin Kershner was given the duty based on his previous work with Connery on A Fine Mess from 1966, as well as his success with The Empire Strikes Back. Excuse me. And to make this film feel like George Lucas and Steven Spielberg snuck on set to produce the film, many crew members from Raiders of the Lost Ark were hired to work on Never Say Never Again, including first assistant director David Tomlin, director of cinematography Douglas Lacombe, who also shot The Fearless Vampire Killers, The Lion and Winter, The Italian Job, Jesus Christ Superstar, the 1974 version of The Great Gatsby, Rollerball, Julia, and The Pirates of Penzance. Second unit director Mickey Moore, who did the same on Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid, Patton, Sometimes a Great Notion, The Man Who Would Be King, The Missouri Breaks, Airport 77, Damnation Alley, Ishtar, Willow, Funny Farm, Ghostbusters 2, The Mighty Ducks, Chaplin, Cool Runnings, The Three Musketeers, and Little Giants, and production designers Philip Harrison and Stephen Grimes. Grimes helped work on films like The Misfits, Lawrence of Arabia, Reflections in a Golden Eye, Ryan's Daughter, The Way We Were, The Yakuza, 3 Days of the Condor, Murder by Death, The Electric Horseman, Urban Cowboy, True Confessions, On Golden Pond, Kroll, The Dresser, Out of Africa, and The Dead. Add in Michael Kahn as editor, and you would have had a full set. And now, we get to the filming, where a particular studio used for Raiders of the Lost Ark was also used for this film. Never Say Never Again's filming commenced on September 27, 1982, starting on the French Riviera for 2 months before moving to Nassau in the Bahamas in mid-November, taking place at Clifton Pier, where it was also seen in Thunderball. In fact, Nassau was also a location for Casino Royale's filming, and was even a stand-in for Grease during an ocean scene in For Your Eyes Only, and was also shown in the Beatles film Help. And that also reminds me that at some point I need to go back and play Assassin's Creed 4 Black Flag, which takes place in Nassau. Moving from that, Largo's Pomeranian base, Fortress, was actually the historic Fort Carré in Antibes. His ship, the Flying Saucer, was portrayed by the yacht Kingdom 5KR, which was the inspiration for a song found off of Queen's album The Miracle called Khashoggi's Ship, which was named after the ship's then owner, Adnan Khashoggi, and was called Nabila. Meanwhile, the underwater scenes were shot by Rico Browning, who had done so previously for Thunderball, and was also known for playing the Gill Man in Creature from the Black Lagoon, and all other principal photography shots were finished at Elstree Studios, where the interiors were filmed, and, you guessed it, was also where Raiders of the Lost Ark had scenes filmed there, along with those for the other Indiana Jones films and Star Wars, with Elstree also housing the Tears of Allah underwater cavern, which took 3 months to put together, and the Shrublands Health Spa was filmed at Luton's Hoo, which serves as a filming location for a more official Bond film with The World's Not Enough, as well as movies like A Shot in the Dark, Four Weddings and a Funeral, Eyes Wide Shut, The Secret Garden, Wild, Quills, and Enigma. A good majority of the shooting was done in spring 1983, with some additional shots being performed in summer of that year, all to prepare for its October release date. But we'll save that for later. Production was no walk in the park, however, as Sean Connery took on many of the production duties with assistant producer David Tomlin, and Irvin Kershner had criticisms regarding producer Jack Schwartzman, stating he was a good businessman but had about as much experience as a film producer as Sugar Conroy has experience playing guitar for David Lee Roth. Schwartzman even had to pay out of pocket after the production ran out of money, admitting later on that he underestimated just how much money it would have cost to make the film, while he and Connery feuded with each other to the point where they hardly ever spoke with each other, as Connery disliked how unprofessional the behind-the-scenes were, calling it a Mickey Mouse operation. One last thing to hammer the point home how rough the production was, Steven Seagal broke Connery's wrist during training, and on an episode of The Tonight Show with Jay Leno, he even said that he was unaware his wrist was broken until a decade later, which means he probably didn't feel it until after the fact. Even back then, nobody knew the dangers of working with Seagal. You can just ask Jenny McCarthy. She didn't even get a part because she went stripped for that pervert. But before this becomes an expose on why Steven Seagal is a piece of crap, let's go to the music and certain things that were done to avoid Cubby's lawyers. For the music, the late James Horner, the composer for Titanic, Aliens, Cocoon, Braveheart, Star Trek II: The Wrath of Khan, Star Trek III: The Search for Spock, Avatar, Honey, I Shrunk the Kids, Apollo 13, A Beautiful Mind, An American Tail, The Mask of Zorro, Field of Dreams, The Land Before Time, Jumanji, Casper, Patriot Games, and Clear and Present Danger, Commando, Red Heat, and Willow, was the first choice of Irvin Kershner and Jack Schwartzman. But this never went through because, according to Schwartzman, Sean Connery vetoed him, while according to Kershner, he was in London a lot of the time. Either way, this wasn't meant to be. Excuse me. And much like with Tom Mankiewicz and Peter R. Hunt, they couldn't get John Barry in the composer's chair because he was loyal to Eon. Probably should have gone with Bill Conti or Marvin Hamlish instead, as Hamlish had replaced Barry during the production of The Spy Who Loved Me, and For Your Eyes Only had Conti on the composing seat, when John Barry was unavailable because he was a tax exile and needed to escape England sometimes. That or have John Williams do the score. That's something I would have loved to have seen. Ultimately though, it was Michel Legrand, whose most notable film scores included two French New Wave films, The Umbrellas of Cherbourg and The Young Girls of Rochefort, as well as The Thomas Crown Affair, Summer of 42, Yentl, Lady Sings the Blues, F for Fake, and Atlantic City, who composed a score that felt akin to his work as a jazz pianist, which some criticize as anachronistic and misjudged, bizarrely intermittent, and the most disappointing feature of the film. But I'll give you my 2 cents soon enough, which will be less critical. Legrand also composed the theme for Never Say Never Again, with lyrics provided by Alan and Marilyn Bergman. who all had worked together to create the song The Windmills of Your Mind for the Thomas Crown Affair, which had won an Oscar. Never Say Never Again was performed by Lonnie Hall after Bonnie Tyler declined because she didn't like the song. Phyllis Hyman, best known for songs like You Know How to Love Me and Don't Want to Change the World, contributed a potential theme song with music courtesy of Stephen Forsythe and lyrics by Jim Ryan, but this was passed over due to Legrand's contractual obligations with the music. But the song was an unsolicited submission, so that wasn't happening. And to wrap it all up, to avoid any lawsuits from Eon, Danjaq, United Artists, or good old Kelby Broccoli, many hallmarks of the mainline James Bond films were excluded, including the iconic gun barrel sequence, which was instead replaced by a bunch of 007 symbols popping up on screen, and the iconic James Bond theme could not be used, with no form of replacement present here. And while there was a pre-credit scene filmed, it ultimately went unused, with the film opening with the credits above the top of the sequence of Bond performing a training exercise. Now then, let's get down to the final verdict, because it's time to do that, shall we? Never Say Never Again is a film that is certainly an anomaly in terms of the James Bond lineage of films. It's a Bond film without the association of United Artists, Eon Productions, Danjaq, or Albert R. Broccoli, and is only one of 2 Bond movies like this, the other being the other Casino Royale, of which the only thing I know about it is that certain parts of that film were used in a better Bond parody with Austin Powers' International Man of Mystery, namely the spinning bed.
Do I make you horny? Randy? Do I make you horny, baby? Yeah, do I?
The idea of this being a Bond film without any of what I just mentioned, on top of the staples of traditional Bond films, is like a Star Wars production that has no involvement from Lucasfilm, Disney, or even George Lucas in general, but instead was produced by Jerry Bruckheimer, directed by John Woo, with a script by Bob Gale of Back to the Future and Eric Roth of Forrest Gump and Dune, and had music composed by Danny Elfman instead of John Williams. In fact, Elfman would have made his own theme. Had a ballad by Kenny Loggins, Phil Collins, and Don Henley, with additional songs performed by Pearl Jam and Iron Maiden, and was distributed by Paramount Pictures. That or a SpongeBob production, produced without Nickelodeon, and instead through Amblin Entertainment, and directed by Martin Scorsese, with a script by Scorsese, Steven Spielberg, and Tom Ruegger, and distributed by Sony through Columbia Pictures. No matter how you slice it, it's quite different. But does that mean it's bad? Excuse me. No. Honestly, it's pretty good. And I actually quite like this movie. It may not have the Eon-produced hallmarks of the Bond films, but it does have the spectacle and excitement found in those films, and then some, on top of giving the audience what they want. Sean Connery on screen as James Bond again, for the last time. On screen anyway. But before we get to Sir Connery's return, let's talk about the other things, like for example, the cinematography, which is excellent. The shots of Nassau and the likes are gorgeous, and the underwater sequences are incredible, proving that having Rico Browning returning to film the underwater sequences 18 years later, and having Douglas Lacombe as cinematographer following his work on Raiders of the Lost Ark was a great choice, as you can really tell the quality here. Also, between Slocum shooting Never Say Never Again and the first 3 Indiana Jones films, and Alan Hume, who shot Return of the Jedi, and the Eon-produced Bond films For Your Eyes Only, Octopussy, and A View to a Kill, there are quite a lot of ties between James Bond movies and Lucasfilm Productions, which also makes you wonder, what would a Steven Spielberg, George Lucas produced James Bond look like? It's quality stuff, proving that even in a non-Eon Bond film, great cinematography always is abundant, and really shows how well produced these films are. It's also a well-paced film, making sure to get the ball rolling from the start, and while it makes sure to give a good idea of who the characters are, never drags on and gets to the action at the drop of a hat. It's quick to the action, relaxes when it needs to, and when it's time to wake up, that means the action's revving again. And that's good, because I can't stress how much pacing is important. In fact, I may just have to make a video about that. The pacing also helps make this 2 hour and 14 minute runtime go by real smoothly, which, given how a lot of the official Bond flicks run around the same length, and in my opinion are also well paced, it also feels in keeping with those. It also has some good production design, and you can tell that the filmmakers put Elstree Studios to good use in making these sets come to life. From the interior of the Flying Saucer, to the Tears of Allah, and the Fortress in Palmyra, these sets look great. And it also proves that they didn't need Pinewood Studios to get those quality sets, because they already had the place where Return of the Jedi was also being filmed, meaning 1983 was a great year for Elstree. It really does feel like George Lucas secretly produced this, and with its set design, it is an awesome wonder to behold and gives it character, so that it feels like a Bond film even without Cubby's involvement. And now we come to the acting, and which is the main course of this meal. And we must first start, of course, with Sean Connery returning once again to play James Bond for the 7th time on screen. Though not the final time, because 22 years later he would voice him for the video game adaptation of From Russia with Love. And well, you most definitely get what you pay for here. Even at 52 to 53 years of age, Connery still got it as Bond, complete with the charm, the charisma, the tuxedo, and the power to woo almost every woman he can. Meaning he may not have wanted to play Bond again, but he still doesn't sleepwalk through it and actually stays cool as the classic super spy. Connery is the Bond that legends are made of, and he's the template for what George Lazenby, Roger Moore, Timothy Dalton, Pierce Brosnan, and Daniel Craig have often followed, while adding their own spins on said character. And he's still in his element even after 12 years of saying he was done with the character, complete with some classic exchanges, like this one.
I need a urine sample. If you could fill this beaker for me.
From here?
Moving from Connery, you have Klaus Maria Brandauer as Maximilian Largo, the Emilio Largo of the film. The main central bad guy who steals some nuclear missiles with the intent of destroying the whole world, not unlike his earlier counterpart. He may not have the eye patch or the white hair of Adolfo Celli's character from Thunderball, but Brandauer does have that crazy and dastardly quality to him, and also makes the character quite amusing down to a T, being cold and calculating at times when he toys with Bond, charming when at first with Domino, completely maniacal when Domino joins up with Bond. Brandauer is Largo, and Largo is bad news all around, so it works. It really does work. Brandauer is the kind of actor you know will be in a Bond film as either an ally or main central antagonist, and much like with Jeroen Krabbe as Georgi Koskov in The Living Daylights, makes the part memorable until the very end. Then there's also Barbara Carrera as Fatima Blush, taking the place of Fiona Volpe from Thunderball, and is along the lines of the bad Bond girl, like with Volpe, and my personal favorite, Xenia Onatopp from GoldenEye.
You don't need the gun, Commander.
That depends on your definition of safe sex.
Carrera is quite good as Blush, playing the part as sexy and seductive, and as soon as she has you in her clutches, could end up sending you into a hole with a tombstone sitting right there. And much like with Luciana Paluzzi as Volpe, captures the sexy vibe superbly, making her a memorable femme fatale for sure. And while she may not go out with a savage one-liner from Bond, like with Volpe,
Do you mind if my friend sits this one out? She's just dead.
she does go out in a pretty memorable fashion nonetheless. And then there's Kim Basinger as Domino Pitachi, Largo's girlfriend who soon becomes smitten with Bond, especially after she learns that Largo had her brother killed to serve his plan. The best way to sum up Kim Basinger in this film is by explaining how I feel about her, which is I turn into Garth Algar almost every time. Observe.
Hello.
Excuse me, I fell.
Would you like some red rope licorice?
Why, sure.
Ugh.
I must have slipped.
Take me, Garth.
Where? I'm low on gas and you need a jacket.
I'm gonna be frank.
Okay, can I still be Garth?
Needless to say, I love it! She's sexy, she's cool, and Basinger has great chemistry with Connery, proving that she was made to play a Bond girl. And rest assured, Domino is very likable, not unlike Claudine Auger's earlier portrayal in Thunderball. So, there's a lot to love. There's also memorable appearances from Max von Sydow as Ernst Stavro Blofeld, the leader of Spectre, who definitely feels like he would influence Christoph Waltz's portrayal in the Craig Bond films, although in a deleted scene, Blofeld was actually supposed to die in the film. Bernie Casey as Felix Leiter, Bond's closest ally with the CIA and friend who plays well off of Connery. Alec McCowan as Q, a.k.a. Algie or Algernon, the 00 section quartermaster who supplies Bond with all his fancy gadgets, and while he may not be as memorable as Desmond Llewellyn's classic portrayal, still shines in this film as a Q who's under-budgeted beyond all comprehension. Edward Fox as M, who isn't interested in the 00 division, but is forced to reopen it after trouble starts brewing, and in some ways feels like a template for what would become Judi Dench's characterization. The late Pamela Salem as Miss Moneypenny, M's secretary who Bond often would flirt with. And she may not be no Lois Maxwell, but she is memorable, especially for those Whovians out there. And Rowan Atkinson as Nigel Small Fawcett, the Foreign Office rep in the Bahamas who assists Bond. And being that it's Rowan Atkinson, lends his comedic chops for certain scenes where it calls for it, especially following Not the 9 O'Clock News. Plus, keep on the lookout for Pat Roach as Lip, the goon who tries to kill Bond at the clinic. He often played the heavy in the first 3 Indiana Jones films, and General Kale in Willow. Valerie Leon as a lady in the Bahamas that Bond seduces. She had previously appeared in The Spy Who Loved Me as the hotel receptionist. Anthony Sharp, Sir Frederick in A Clockwork Orange, as Lord Ambrose, the man who orders them to get the 00 division back online. And Chuck Cunningham himself, Gavano Herlihy, as Jack Patachi, Domino's brother who is used by Spectre to steal the missiles. The action is also pretty good here. Can't believe some top-notch stunt work from everyone involved, and sometimes where it gets pretty suspenseful. My personal favorite is the motorcycle sequence. from the way that it moves and how it all plays out, complete with great stunt work from everyone involved, including Connery. Not to mention, there's the sequence where Bond and Largo are essentially playing a video game where the more they go on, they are each receiving electric shocks until one gives up. And just when you think Bond meets his match, he gets the upper hand, making for a very engaging sequence. And to wrap it all up, the music isn't half bad, and compared to how critics felt about it, I actually kinda dig it. There's moments where it feels action-packed, there's moments where it has a nice jazz feel to it. It honestly isn't too bad of a score, and does feel like a Bond film in some cases. It may not be John Barry, but compared to the version of Final Fight found on Final Fight Streetwise, it's better than that. Not to mention, Lonnie Hall's theme is pretty memorable, and honestly is one of the things I remember the most about this film. Complete with a good rhythm and impressive vocals from the singer, so there's a plus. So yeah, Never Say Never is a pretty good time. It may not be Eon, but it is sure fun, and I'm glad I got to watch it again. Plus, I got to talk about a Bond film, so there's a bonus. Never Say Never Again had its release on October 7th, 1983, where it made a worldwide gross of $160 million on a budget of $36 million, which made it a commercial success, albeit making less than Eon's Bond film Octopussy, which made $187.5 million and had been released earlier that year. It also got positive reviews from critics, with Roger Ebert and Gene Siskel awarding the film 3.5 out of 4 stars, as well as praises from Janet Maslin, Gary Arnold of the Washington Post, and Jay Scott, who even claimed that of all the Bond films, this one was the only one with a first-rate director. More modern reviews are a bit more mixed due to it being an unofficial Bond film, but do seem more positive than negative. I mean, it does at least have a positive score on Rotten Tomatoes, so it's not like it's on a list of the worst films ever. Amazingly though, Never Say Never Again was going to at one point be the start of a new line of James Bond movies produced by Jack Schwartzman and starring Sean Connery, with Kevin McClory announcing the next intended film, Spectre, in a February 1984 edition of Screen International. Ultimately though, Connery wasn't interested in playing Bond again for Schwartzman, and this announcement came just 3 weeks before the deadline came to purchase the rights to another film for $5 million. Schwartzman said that he was unlikely to produce such a film without having to put up with MGM UA or Danjaq, and so that ship sailed. McClory did attempt to make another version of Thunderball under the title of Warhead 2000 AD, with it possibly going to star Timothy Dalton, but this never came to pass, and in 1997, Sony Pictures bought McClory's rights for an undisclosed amount and announced that they were going to make their own series of Bond films, as they also owned the film rights to Casino Royale. This then led to MGM putting up a round of litigation that was later settled out of court, which forced Sony to drop all claims on Bond, while McClory tried to make another Bond film, for which he continued his case against both MGM and Danjaq, which the court soon rejected on August 27, 2001. MGM's acquisition of the rights to Casino Royale finally gave Eon the chance to make a serious, non-satirical film adaptation of the novel with Daniel Craig as James Bond, and in 2013, McClory's heirs finally sold the Thunderball rights to Eon, this coming 7 years after his death on November 20th, 2006, and was soon able to reintroduce Ernst Stavro Blofeld to the franchise with Spectre, ending over 5 decades of copyright nightmares. Oh, And on December 4th, 1997, MGM later said that they had gained the rights to Never Say Never Again from Schwartzman's company Thalia Film, and since then has handled the DVD and Blu-ray distribution for the film. Same goes for Casino Royale 67, meaning they got all the Bond and nobody else does. So that's pretty much everything. Quite an adventure, huh? And that is Never Say Never Again. It may not have been produced by Eon Productions, but it's still a pretty good movie, and I do recommend that you check it out. Whether you decide to pick it up on DVD as part of this collection here or by itself, or you decide to pick it up on Blu-ray, it's a film that, in my opinion, is worth checking out, if only for the fact that Sean Connery is once again playing James Bond on screen for the very last time. And it's really something that you should check out. The action is there and it's awesome. The cinematography is gorgeous. The set design is pretty good. There's some decent music. And of course, Sean Connery as James Bond once again. Even after he retired from that role about 12 years ago prior to doing this film, he still has the charm and charisma to really make it work. Same goes for a lot of the cast in general. I mean, it's a film that you should definitely check out if you are a Bond fan, a Sean Connery fan, a fan of Sean Connery's portrayal of James Bond. Just check it out. I do recommend you watch it. And so with that, this concludes my review for Never Say Never Again. I hope you enjoyed it, found it entertaining, educational, and made you want to seek out this movie. And really just the James Bond movies in general, because this is the first James Bond movie I have covered on the show. And if time will let me, chances are it might not even be the last. Who knows? Maybe I'll do all the James Bond movies. Even the 1967 Casino Royale adaptation, which I have not heard good things about, but hey, it did inspire the spinning bed trick in Austin Powers' International Man of Mystery, so there is that. And so with all that in mind, I will catch you later. Take care.